Have you ever felt like the world's challenges are just so complex, so interconnected, that it's hard to even know where to begin trying to understand them?
Yeah, it can definitely feel overwhelming sometimes.
Today, we're taking a deep dive into a book that really confronts this head on. It urges us to rethink how we actually see global competition. Our mission for you today is to pull out the most critical insights from H.R. McMaster's book, Battlegrounds, The Fight to Defend the Free World.
And it's not just another geopolitics book, is it?
Not at all. It's really framed as a powerful call for renewed, what he calls strategic competence, especially in a world where freedom, security, prosperity, they're constantly being challenged.
Yeah, what McMaster really drives home is this idea that we're at the end of the beginning of a whole new era. He argues that for way too long, this sort of post-Cold War overconfidence, it led to a pretty dangerous complacency.
Complacency, meaning we forgot we have to actually compete.
Exactly. We forgot that maintaining freedom isn't automatic. It requires constant effort, constant competition. And he introduces this really critical concept to explain why we missed that, something he calls strategic narcissism.
Strategic narcissism. That's quite a phrase. It definitely grabs your attention. So what exactly does McMaster mean by that? And how does he argue it's actually misshaped our approach to some of the world's biggest issues?
That's really the core of his argument.
We'll dig into that through his look at key battlegrounds, Russia, China, Iran, these big transnational threats, basically offering you a shortcut to understanding the essential fights for the free world today. Okay, so let's really unpack this core idea, the one that seems to underpin so much of McMaster's argument, strategic narcissism. How does he actually define it, and why does he see it as such a fundamental problem for free societies?
So a key insight here is that strategic narcissism is essentially, it's the tendency to view the world predominantly through our own lens, specifically the United States lens.
Like seeing everything only in relation to us.
Precisely. It's this underlying assumption that the future course of global events hinges mostly on U.S. decisions or U.S. plans. And that naturally means we undervalue the agency, the influence that other nations actually have.
Their own goals and motivations.
Exactly. And this mindset kind of paradoxically can show up in two ways, either as this dangerous overconfidence in our own power or as this sort of debilitating resignation, this feeling that our actions don't really matter or maybe are even the source of the problem.
Interesting. So both extremes are a problem.
Both, McMaster points out, are ultimately self-defeating because they attribute outcomes almost entirely to what the U.S. does or doesn't do, instead of really grappling with the complex interplay of all the international actors involved.
It's easy to see how that kind of thinking could take root, especially after, say, a big success. And McMaster points to a specific moment, the 1991 Gulf War, and particularly the Battle of 73 Easting, as maybe a key turning point that really cemented this strategic narcissism.
Ah, yes, 73 Easting.
What was so significant about that victory, beyond just the obvious military success itself? Why does he focus on that?
The Battle of 73 Easting was an absolutely astonishing display of military capability. You had units like Eagle Troop achieving these incredibly lopsided victories.
Destroying huge enemy formations with zero casualties.
Exactly, without suffering any casualties themselves. That and the whole Gulf War success was undeniably impressive. But the danger, as McMaster really highlights, was that this success led a lot of analysts to undervalue the qualitative advantages the U.S. has had.
Things like better training, tech.
Better training, superior technology, joint operations capability, all that stuff. And maybe even worse, it led them to incorrectly assume that future adversaries would just make Saddam Hussein's mistake again, trying to fight the U.S. head-on conventionally.
Ah, okay. So it fostered this overconfidence that we'd always get to fight on our terms.
Instead of realizing we'd constantly need to adapt to new threats like asymmetric warfare, which is exactly what happened later.
So this mindset takes hold, and he argues it's just continued, influencing different administrations, Republican and Democrat. Can you give us a concrete example of how this strategic narcissism played out? Maybe one showing the overconfident side and one showing the resignation side.
Absolutely. If you look at the broader arc of U.S. foreign policy since then, you can definitely see these patterns. McMaster points to, say, the George W. Bush administration's initial over-optimism. That led, he argues, to underestimating the risks involved in the 2003 Iraq invasion. That's a pretty clear case of overconfidence.
Okay.
Then, conversely, he critiques the Obama administration's pessimism about how effective U.S. engagement could actually be. He suggests this led to underappreciating the risks of inaction.
Inaction being risky too.
Definitely. For instance, the decision for a complete withdrawal of U.S. forces from Iraq in 2011. McMaster argues that created a really dangerous vacuum, one that contributed significantly to the rise of ISIS.
Right, I remember those debates.
And another example he gives is the 2013 decision not to conduct military reprisals after chemical weapons were used in Syria. In both these cases, he suggests, leaders were finding problems the way they preferred them to be instead of confronting the harder, messier realities. That's a hallmark of strategic narcissism.
So if strategic narcissism is the problem, what's the solution McMaster proposes? He has another key phrase for that, right?
Yes, strategic empathy. That's what he sees as the crucial corrective.
Strategic empathy.
Yeah.
How does he define that? And why is it so vital for getting us back on course?
Strategic empathy, for McMaster, is really the capacity to understand what truly drives and constrains our adversaries.
So getting inside their heads.
Understanding their ambitions, their fears, their cultural context, how they calculate things strategically but crucially without necessarily agreeing with them or validating their actions.
Okay, so understanding, not endorsing.
Exactly. It's about getting into their mindset so you can anticipate their moves better and then craft more effective counter strategies. Without that empathy, you're essentially playing chess against yourself, making moves based only on your own assumptions. And that's precisely the trap of strategic narcissism.
That concept of strategic empathy brings us right to the actual battlegrounds McMaster dives into. Let's turn to Russia first. He details their pretty aggressive strategy, which he calls new generation warfare. What exactly does that phrase mean? How does it go beyond just tanks and missiles?
Russia's new generation warfare, or you often hear it called hybrid warfare, it's incredibly comprehensive and pretty insidious. It's definitely not just about conventional military power, though it certainly includes that. We saw it clearly with the 2014 annexation of Crimea and the invasion of Ukraine.
Right.
But what makes it new generation is the sophisticated way it combines those conventional capabilities with pervasive cyber attacks and relentless information warfare.
Infowar, like propaganda.
Exactly. Propaganda, disinformation, political subversion, all orchestrated very carefully to exploit existing divisions and vulnerabilities within Western societies. A really chilling example of their cyber power was the NotPetya attack back in 2018.
Oh, I remember that one. It hit everywhere.
It did. It started in Ukraine, but spread incredibly fast, globally, crippling businesses, governments. The total cost was estimated at around $10 billion in damages.
Yeah.
That wasn't just a military strike. It was a massive economic and social disruption campaign.
$10 billion, starting from Ukraine. It really shows how these new generation threats just don't care about borders, do they?
Not at all.
So knowing they can launch that kind of comprehensive attack, how does McMaster say we should even begin to understand Putin's underlying motivations? What does the book suggest really drives his aggressive stance beyond just geopolitical maneuvering?
Well, McMaster argues that Putin is driven by this really powerful mix of deep-seated emotions and objectives. He identifies three main drivers: fear, honor, and ambition.
Fear, honor, and ambition. Okay.
He's intensely fearful of color revolutions, these popular uprisings that could threaten his grip on power. And he's haunted by the memory of the Soviet Union's collapse, which he apparently views as a profound national humiliation.
And the honor part.
His sense of honor, McMaster argues, was deeply insulted by what Putin sees as the West's triumphalism after winning the Cold War. And his ambition, it isn't necessarily about building Russia back into some glorious global superpower. It might be something more destructive.
Destructive how?
Like dragging others down, weakening rival states, unraveling the alliance networks like NATO that give those states their strategic advantages. There was actually a very real and often overlooked example of this back in February 2018.
What happened then?
Russian mercenaries directly attacked U.S. forces over an old Conoco oil plant in Syria. It was a significant clash. U.S. and allied forces ended up killing over 200 of those Russian mercenaries without suffering any casualties themselves. It was a stark reminder of their willingness to test boundaries, to directly engage.
Wow, 200 killed. And Russia's disinformation campaign, you mentioned that. It sounds particularly insidious. He calls it a fire hose of falsehood. How does that fire hose tactic actually work? What's the goal?
What's really crucial to grasp about Russian disinformation, McMaster says, is that it completely abandons any attempt at consistency. It's not like traditional propaganda that tries to build a coherent, even if biased, story.
So what is the goal then?
The goal of the fire hose of falsehood is designed to make audiences just question everything. It's not about making you believe a specific new lie, but rather to disrupt, to divide, and ultimately to weaken societies by just eroding trust. Trust in institutions, trust in the media, even trust in basic facts.
Creating chaos, basically.
Exactly. A prime example was the Internet Research Agency, the IRA. They were incredibly active on social media during the 2016 US election. They created fake news sites, pushed bizarre conspiracy theories like Pizzagate,
Right, that was wild.
and they reached an estimated 126 million people just on Facebook alone. It was a systematic, calculated effort to just sow discord and confusion.
So given how pervasive and multifaceted this threat, how do we even begin to counter it? Especially when, as you said, they exploit the very openness of our democratic societies. Does McMaster offer any lessons, maybe from countries closer to Russia?
Yeah, that's a huge challenge for free societies. McMaster does highlight some lessons, particularly from countries right on the Russian frontier, like
Estonia. What do they do?
after they endured this massive, sustained cyber offensive back in 2007, Estonia developed a really robust national defense strategy. It was built on, first, a clear understanding of the threat, then determined leadership, and really strong public-private cooperation.
Public-private, like companies and government working together.
Yes, they implemented things like secure digital identity programs for all citizens and mandatory cybersecurity baselines for critical infrastructure. It shows that building strong digital defenses is actually possible. But he also notes, interestingly, that Russian meddling can sometimes backfire. Take the failed coup attempt in Montenegro in 2016, which Russia apparently backed. That whole episode, ironically, just accelerated Montenegro's admission into NATO.
The opposite effect.
Right. And similarly, he argues that Russian efforts to divide Americans actually, in some ways, united Congress in 2017 to pass pretty severe sanctions against Russia. So, while the threat is absolutely real and dangerous, it's not necessarily invincible. There are ways to push back, and sometimes their actions have unintended consequences.
Okay, so we've looked at Russia exploiting our vulnerabilities, often fueled by that strategic narcissism we talked about. Now, McMaster pivots to what he describes as perhaps the larger and more complicated threat, China. How does their strategy, which he characterizes as an obsession with control, present a different kind of challenge to the free world?
Yeah, the Chinese Communist Party's, or CCP's, strategy is definitely rooted in what McMaster calls an obsession with control. And that control is both domestic, obviously, but increasingly it's projected internationally as well.
And the goal?
Chairman Xi Jinping's big, overarching vision is for the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation, which, fundamentally, means China taking center stage in the world. McMaster uses this compelling image of Xi giving President Trump a tour of the Forbidden City.
Right, projecting confidence.
Exactly, projecting this outward confidence. But McMaster argues that beneath that surface lies deep insecurity and, of course, a brutal history of internal repression. The CCP's control isn't just political dissent, it extends to nearly every aspect of Chinese life, society, economy, pervasive surveillance, censorship, you name it.
We hear a lot about China's economic power, obviously. But the book really details how that economic clout is intricately tied into a strategy to expand influence, often through something that's been called debt trap diplomacy. Can you give us some specific examples of how that actually plays out?
Absolutely. This is a really critical point McMaster makes. If you connect this to the bigger picture, China's massive One Belt, One Road initiative, or OBR, while it's presented as infrastructure development, it provides some stark examples of what looks like debt trap diplomacy.
Okay, like where?
Consider the Maldives. Tiny island nation, only about 400,000 people. They ended up incurring over $1.5 billion in debt to China.
Wow. For a small country, that's huge.
It's massive, and this debt was largely for strategically important maritime infrastructure. The result? A significant loss of sovereignty as the nation became increasingly dependent on and beholden to Beijing.
And you mentioned another example.
Malaysia is another powerful case. There was a $16 billion rail project, which apparently cost about twice its actual value. McMaster argues this project effectively bailed out a corrupt prime minister at the time.
And the consequence?
Again, a loss of sovereign control. Malaysia had to concede significant leverage to China. It's a very sophisticated way of gaining strategic influence and leverage, not through military force initially, but through economic dependency.
And it's not just nations, right? The book points out that American companies have faced coercion too. He mentions the Daryl Morey incident. What happened there, and what does it tell us about the CCP's methods extending abroad?
The Daryl Morey incident in October 2019, it's a really vivid illustration of how the CCP tries to exert its control far beyond China's borders. Morey, who was then the general manager of the Houston Rockets basketball team,
Right, in the NBA.
he simply tweeted support for the pro-democracy protesters in Hong Kong, just a tweet. The reaction from Beijing was immediate and incredibly severe. Chinese state-run TV instantly canceled broadcasts of Rockets games. The entire NBA suddenly faced potentially over $100 million in lost contracts and deals in China
Just for one tweet from one manager.
just for one tweet. And what's maybe even more telling, some leading NBA figures like LeBron James actually publicly chastised Mori for his comments, basically telling him to be quiet.
Wow.
This episode starkly demonstrates how the CCP applies its internal control methods similar to its infamous social credit system externally, to suppress any criticism anywhere and enforce its preferred narrative globally, even on foreign soil, using foreign companies and individuals to do it.
That's quite chilling. So given that level of ambition and control, what does a realistic strategy to counter the CCP's aggression look like, according to McMaster? Does it go beyond just playing defense? What proactive steps does he suggest?
McMaster really stresses moving beyond what he calls these sort of aspirational views of China, hoping they'll just become a responsible stakeholder. He says we need a truly realistic appraisal of their actual intentions and capabilities.
And what does that look like in practice?
It involves concrete actions, like, he suggests, penalizing U.S. companies that knowingly collaborate with CCP repression or its military buildup. For example, companies providing DNA sampling equipment used for the mass surveillance and repression of the Uyghurs in Xinjiang.
Holding companies accountable.
Right. And critically, he also calls for the U.S. to urgently reform its own, often chronic, bureaucratic inertia, especially in defense procurement. Our slow, inflexible acquisition systems stifle innovation.
Making it hard to keep up.
Exactly. It makes it incredibly difficult to compete effectively with China, especially in emerging technologies like AI, where their centralized system, state funding, and frankly, often looser ethical considerations give them a perceived advantage. So it's really about strengthening our own foundations while also holding them accountable for their actions.
Okay, so it's clear how strategic narcissism, this idea of seeing the world only through our own lens, led to miscalculations with Russia and China. Now, let's shift our focus to the Middle East and South Asia. This is a region where, as McMaster really points out, this same cycle of overconfidence followed by pessimism has led to decades of inconsistent and often deeply flawed U.S. strategies. Let's start with Afghanistan and Pakistan. What does he see as the key mistakes there?
Yeah, his description of the war in Afghanistan is pretty stark. He calls it a one-year war fought 20 times over.
Wow. What does that mean exactly?
It really highlights what he sees as a fundamental failure year after year to truly understand the deeply traumatized society we were operating in and the complex political drivers fueling the violence. A critical aspect he details is the persistent duplicity, is the word he uses, of Pakistan.
Pakistan's duplicity. How?
While Pakistan was ostensibly an ally in the war on terror, receiving billions in U.S. aid, McMaster argues they simultaneously and actively supported groups like the Afghan Taliban and the Haqqani Network. They saw these groups as a useful arm of their foreign policy, mainly against India.
So supporting militants while fighting terrorism.
Exactly. This was happening even as Pakistan was battling other terrorist groups that had turned against the Pakistani state itself, groups like Tehrik-i-Taliban Pakistan, the TTP. They were responsible for horrific attacks inside Pakistan, like the Peshawar Army public school massacre that killed 145 people, mostly children. It was this profoundly contradictory double game that just complicated everything enormously.
The book describes this cycle of frustration in U.S.-Pakistan relations because of this duplicity. How did McMaster himself, when he was National Security Advisor, try to break that cycle? What was his approach?
He apparently adopted a very direct, almost blunt approach. He aimed to force a moment of clarity, basically. McMaster told the Pakistani generals he met with that the U.S. would, from that point on, pay far more attention to deeds, not words.
Less talk, more action.
Pretty much. He explicitly said the U.S. would stop asking them to do more. Instead, he asked them to do less, specifically, to provide less support to the organizations that were actively killing U.S. and Afghan soldiers and murdering Afghan civilians.
That's quite direct.
And to really emphasize the point, as he was leaving one meeting, he apparently handed them a handwritten list of U.S. and allied hostages known to be held by the Haqqani Network, basically making it clear the U.S. knew what was going on and expected action, or at least non-interference. It was a tough, unambiguous message designed to cut through the usual diplomatic niceties.
Moving to the broader Middle East now. The book critiques how both ends of that strategic narcissism spectrum, the overconfidence and the pessimism, continue to impact U.S. policy in places like Iraq and Syria, often with really devastating consequences.
This raises that important question about the long-term impact of these policy swings, often driven by domestic politics as much as strategic thinking. McMaster argues that Bush administration's optimistic, but he feels ultimately unprepared, invasion of Iraq. That was the overconfidence part, followed by the Obama administration's perhaps precipitous withdrawal of all U.S. forces in 2011. The pessimism or resignation part created this dangerous power vacuum, a vacuum that he argues directly contributed to the terrifying rise of ISIS.
So one decision compounded the other.
That's the argument. Similarly, he points to the Trump administration's sudden 2019 withdrawal from Syria. He notes that severely damaged U.S. credibility, especially with allies on the ground, and allowed Russian, Iranian, and Turkish forces to just flood into the void. This led, he points out, to horrific war crimes against our Kurdish allies who had fought bravely alongside the U.S. against ISIS.
A betrayal, essentially.
That's how many saw it. He highlights figures like Iraqi Prime Minister Haider al-Abadi as the kind of unifying leader the U.S. should have consistently supported, emphasizing the tragedy of these missed opportunities to potentially stabilize Iraq and the wider region, often derailed by inconsistent U.S. policy.
And then, of course, there's Iran, with its, as the book puts it, 40-year proxy wars across the region, and the really contentious 2015 nuclear deal, the JCPOA. What's McMaster's core critique of that agreement? Why was he sympathetic to the view that it was, quote, the worst deal ever?
McMaster certainly makes it clear he was sympathetic to that critical view. His argument is that the JCPOA was fundamentally flawed because, in his view, it stubbornly ignored the Iranian regime's unwavering hostility towards the U.S. and its allies, and its inherently untrustworthy nature based on decades of behavior.
So the deal didn't address the core problem.
He felt that rather than genuinely restraining Iran, the deal effectively provided the regime with significant financial resources from sanctions relief and valuable diplomatic cover, resources and cover, he argues, that they then used to intensify their extensive proxy wars and destabilizing activities across the Middle East, from Yemen to Syria to Lebanon. The deal focused narrowly on the nuclear program, ignoring all the other malign activities.
And then he points to history.
Yes, he recounts historical instances of Iranian duplicity, like the Iran-Contra affair back in the 80s, and explains how the regime consistently uses this virulent anti-Americanism as a tool to consolidate power domestically, often blaming the U.S. for its own internal problems and protests just to deflect popular discontent.
Okay, so given this assessment of deep-seated hostility and duplicity, what does the book suggest is the most effective path forward with Iran? Especially considering the complexities, like distinguishing the regime from the Iranian people.
This is where that idea of strategic empathy comes back in again, but applied carefully. He emphasizes the critical need to distinguish the repressive Iranian regime from the Iranian people themselves, who often hold vastly different views and aspirations.
They support the people, contain the regime.
Something like that. He suggests, first, improving defenses against Iran's growing military and cyber capabilities deterrence is key, but simultaneously finding ways to engage and support the Iranian people directly. For example, by helping them bypass the regime's heavy censorship to facilitate open communication and access to uncensored information.
And preparing for conflict.
And also preparing realistically for potential escalation, given the regime's nature. But critically, McMaster also calls out regional allies, specifically mentioning Saudi Arabia, urging them to cease funding extremist ideologies. He notes the kingdom's historical role in propagating strains of intolerance that have fueled instability and conflict across the region, sometimes creating conditions Iran exploits. So the path forward is complex, requiring deterrence, engagement with the population, and also addressing the wider ideological context.
This has been incredibly insightful looking at these specific regions. But near the end, the book broadens its scope. So what does this all mean for us looking forward? Beyond these specific regional threats, McMaster focuses on some crucial cross-cutting areas for future security and prosperity, things like technology, education, and alliances. Let's start with technology. How does he describe the evolving nature of the threat there? Just about cyber attacks?
It's definitely more than just cyber attacks, though those are a huge part. What's really critical to acknowledge, he argues, is how technologies we once saw as inherently liberating, like the internet itself, are now being systematically weaponized by authoritarian regimes.
Weaponized how?
Well, China, for example, uses its Great Firewall not just for censorship, but for incredibly pervasive surveillance and social control. Iran maintains stringent internet restrictions, throttling access during protests. These regimes are turning the tools of connection into instruments of repression and control.
So what should democracies do?
For democratic societies, McMaster stresses the urgent need to design more resilient cyber systems. He talks about the concept of graceful degradation.
Graceful degradation, what's that?
It means systems that can absorb an attack, maybe lose some functionality, but continue to operate at a reduced capacity or recover very quickly, He points to Ukraine's power grid, which, despite being relatively old, allowed for rapid restoration after a major Russian cyber attack because of its design.
Build resilience in.
Exactly. And he delivers a stark warning about supply chains. He likens accepting companies like Huawei or ZTE companies deeply linked to the Chinese state into our critical communications networks to basically opening Troy's gates. He stresses the absolute need for vigilance against compromised infrastructure.
That's a powerful analogy. McMaster then makes a very strong statement later in the book. He argues that education may be the most important competition for the future. Why such a strong claim? What's behind that?
Yeah, it's a really striking claim. This raises that crucial point about societal resilience again. He draws a direct parallel to the post-Sputnik era, back in 1957.
When the Soviets launched the first satellite.
That shock, the fear of falling behind the Soviet Union, galvanized the U.S. Congress into passing the National Defense Education Act of 1958. And that act prioritized not just science and engineering, but also history, political science, and foreign languages.
A broad push.
A very broad push. And McMaster calls for a similar, renewed national initiative today. His core argument is that an educated citizens who are truly informed about the challenges to national security, who understand history, who can recognize adversaries' tactics like disinformation, they are far less vulnerable to manipulation.
Makes sense.
Education, in his view, is the ultimate inoculant for a society. Protection against efforts to foment hatred, incite violence, and erode democratic institutions from within or without. It's about building our cognitive resilience, basically, from the ground up.
And finally, a theme that really weaves throughout Battlegrounds is the indispensable role of alliances. Why does he see them as so critical in this new era of competition? Especially when, as he notes, some voices, even within the U.S., seem to question their value sometimes.
He strongly reinforces the value of alliances, particularly with nations on what strategists call the rimland of the Eurasian landmass, think Europe, East Asia. These allies are invaluable, he argues.
Why invaluable?
For multiple reasons. They serve, obviously, as a crucial deterrent to aggression just by their geography and capability. But they also help accumulate moral and military capability far beyond what the U.S. could ever possess or sustain alone. Strength in numbers, shared burdens, shared intelligence. Allies also magnify America's diplomatic voice on the world stage and offer critical economic leverage against coercive tactics like the kind China employs. McMaster expresses deep concern that any public expressions of doubt about the value of these alliances are profoundly counterproductive.
Why counterproductive?
Because our adversaries, specifically Russia and China, are actively, constantly trying to break those alliances apart, to isolate the U.S. These alliances, he argues, are absolutely fundamental to our collective strategic competence and our very ability to defend the free world effectively. Undermining them is like dismantling our own strategic advantage.
What an incredibly illuminating deep dive into H.R. McMaster's Battlegrounds. It feels like his core message is just profoundly clear, that overcoming this strategic narcissism isn't really just about confronting external threats, is it?
No, not at all.
It seems much more about an internal recommitment, a recommitment to understanding, to competence, and maybe, most importantly, to a truly realistic view of the world as it is, not as we wish it were.
Indeed. The challenges he outlines posed by Russia, China, Iran, these transnational groups, they aren't just abstract geopolitical chess moves on some distant board. He frames them as direct assaults on the actual principles and institutions that underpin free societies everywhere.
So our ability to compete.
Our ability to compete effectively, yeah. To defend freedom, to maintain security, it really hinges on our willingness to learn from history, to cultivate that genuine strategic empathy we talked about, and critically, to strengthen our own societal foundations against these really multifaceted attacks.
And it feels like this isn't just a message for policymakers in Washington or generals at the Pentagon, right? It feels much broader.
Absolutely. He makes it clear this is for all of us. McMaster shows us that these battlegrounds aren't just in faraway lands. They extend right into our cyber networks, into our financial systems, even into the very classrooms where our next generation is learning about the world.
So the takeaway for you, the listener.
You may ask yourself, in an era where information is so often weaponized and intentions are deliberately obscured by sophisticated actors, how do we, just as individual citizens, contribute? How do we help build a society that's resilient enough to actually discern truth from falsehood and act with wisdom based on that understanding?
Yeah.
How do we ensure that we don't allow ourselves, collectively, to be consumed by the kind of ignorance that McMaster, echoing the writer Saul Bellow he quotes, warns could ultimately threaten our freedom itself? That's really the question, isn't it? And it's one for all of us to keep exploring and actively trying to answer.